Is Canada heading into a lost decade? That's what we're discussing on today's video, so let's get right into it. So first of all, we have to understand a little bit more about the past and why Japan headed into this lost decade. How did they get to this point? Well, basically, after the Second World War, the US basically said to Japan, because of the incredible amounts of damage that was done to the economy and physical damage to Japan in itself, Japan needed to rebuild after that. And the US said to them, instead of having these massive payments like they did with Germany after World War One, which then essentially ended up with the hyperinflation crisis and caused the Second World War, they were smart enough to say, we're not going to do that this time. So as long as you promise not to build a military and use a military and you rely on us for all of that, then you're good to go and we'll let you off the hook on these payments. So that essentially led to an economic boom that was inspired by writing off a lot of the loans which had failed from that time, and then rebuilding the country around a low interest rate environment where money was subsidized and easy to access and easy to get. Essentially, this led to debt being built up by households and being built up by businesses rapidly and rapidly and rapidly. And at the time, it seemed like the Japanese were the richest on earth. They were buying skyscrapers in New York City, and the Japanese seemed like the richest people in the world. I mean, some of the Japanese companies were some of the largest in the world at that time. And they got to that level because of the lending and the growth in loans that happened during that time. So eventually this led into inflation spiking. Doesn't that ring a bell with you right now? So inflation spiked, and this sparked the central bank heading into a tightening cycle, but the economy was just so in debt and the central bank did not understand that. So there was a ton of private debt, there was a ton of household debt, and this tightening cycle that occurred essentially create a massive tsunami through the economy that wasn't visible at the time. Does that seem similar to now? So essentially, after that tightening cycle, unemployment began to rise, and it didn't stop rising. And even after interest rates came back down, there seemingly was nothing that Japan could do to get out of this crisis, because essentially the bubble just got so large that when it popped, it just had devastating consequences. Exactly like the bubble in Canada, in New Zealand, and Australia will have when they burst as well. So one thing that happened as a result of all this was the birth rate absolutely collapsed. Japanese people did not want to have children anymore, and this led to a lost decade that continued. And it was a multitude of factors, the debt that was created over that time, bleeding out of the system over such a long period of time. The unemployment actually didn't go that high, but it did actually take a long time to peak, and it was insanely drawn out. And essentially, if you look at the birth rate in Canada, it actually peaked around 2008 and has been falling ever since then. And that was essentially since the private sector debt bubble was inflated, which I pointed out in a previous video. So the birth rate is actually a huge indicator of a country's direction. The thing is, policymakers and central planners think that they can paper over the fact that the birth rate is so low by bringing in lots of new immigrants. And that's why you see countries like Canada inviting so many immigrants like myself to come to the country.
And we're actually we're doubling down and accepting higher levels of newcomers than we ever have. This is a very strong signal for the importance of immigration to the economy.
Because essentially they have failed their own people. Their own people don't want to have children anymore. So now they're going to bring some more suckers in to hopefully replace the people that their people would have had. But it doesn't really work. And in fact, it destabilizes the economy to an even larger degree. Because think of it like this, an immigrant that you bring over, like myself, is less likely to stay in Canada because they have less ties to Canada. None of my family lives here, etc. And a lot of immigrants are in that situation. So immigrants tend to go wherever there is prosperity. And if there's no longer prosperity in a certain country, then guess what? They don't come anymore. And not only that, as you can see by what I'm putting up on the screen right now, you can clearly see that a ton of people in the middle class will be created in Asia, predominantly in China and India, over the next decade. And that will have massive ramifications for Canada, because it will end up with lots of immigrants leaving, lots of immigrants that would have potentially come not coming anymore. And even if they're able to fill those quotas, they have to simply drop the skill level further and further down, which further compounds the issue of the destabilized economy that you already have. And we're already beginning to see that dynamic working out right now, whereas the immigration that's coming in isn't necessarily having a positive impact on the economy anymore, because they have essentially created a place in Canada where a lot of people just look at it and say, well, it's too expensive. I don't want to live there. And it's going to get even worse when Canada heads into a recession, which is ultimately due to happen, and unemployment starts rising. You're going to get even less people want to come here. And you know, those things, even though they seem like really small things, are absolutely gigantic. They have absolutely huge consequences for an economy. Essentially, the economy that is here in Canada is built off the bubble, exactly like Japan. It's built off lending people money. And it's built off lending people money that they can't afford to pay back. Now, this is something that people fail to understand on so many different scales. And what people fail to understand is that these people cannot afford to pay this money back. It relies on this constant greater fool theory that somebody stupider with more money is going to be able to purchase that. But it's just that the credit has been allowed to expand and expand and expand and just get larger to the point that it has got to a ridiculous level. The thing is, once you get to these sort of alarming levels that Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and many other countries have, it becomes extremely dangerous then. And quite frankly, I feel sorry for people who are moving to Canada right now, because unfortunately they're moving right before the brunt of a recession starts, and that could last many, many decades, little do they know. So the thing is, Canada and Japan, they have very similar things that are at play here. The bubbles were both created out of lending. The bubbles are both going to be disastrous when they burst and be strung out over a long period of time when they burst. So they are very, very similar in that respect. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, maybe watch that video there, or maybe watch this video there that YouTube recommends. Thank you.